Good morning and nice to meet, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and nice to meet you virtually. Today, I'm gonna talk about why our sector is becoming mainstream, and I will gonna give you an applied view from academia. So, a bit about me. My name is Gianluca Pescaroli. I'm assistant professor at University College London, where I'm the lead of the Master in Risk, Disaster and Resilience. We are based in the very, very center of London, near the British Museum. And I'm a bit a mad scientist. So the research I do and what I teach is very applied. I am used to talk with my stakeholders in the public and the private sector. So you may be familiar with my work, or some of you, maybe we already talked together. Otherwise, please do get in touch with me via LinkedIn or any other social media. I started to work back in the days on cascading risk in 2014, and we founded the first research group on the topic in 2016. So you may be willing to check it out. So much before President Biden was talking about cascading disasters. And I try to keep my research very practical. So I do the blue sky thinking and the theory, but also I try to contribute to things like the National Disaster Risk Assessment of the United Nations, the Science for the Year 2020, the flagship report of the European Commission. And most recently, I wrote the definition of power outages for the hazard definition and classification review of the United Nations. I'm used to work with local authorities like the Greater London authorities, with different companies. And I hope today I'm gonna give you an interesting insight. So first of all, I'm gonna introduce you complex events and why you need to be thinking about climate change. Why is this imply your operational capacity and your procedures? But I'm gonna explain you why we don't have to care just about natural hazards. This is very different. Second point, I'm gonna explain you what are cascading effects, common point of failure, and why we need to consider that in terms of planning resilience forward. So I know that some of you are familiar with that, so I'm gonna give you some tools to push the way forward and evolve it together, disaster risk reduction and continuity management. So first of all, let's speak about complex event. So we were used to think disaster management and disaster recovery, crisis management, as something focused on, first response, the basic needs of society that everyone has, like food, shelter. But things are changing radically. In the last 20 years, we have seen that we are all dependent on international supply chain. I'm here right now in London. I was 2 days ago in a family house in Italy. And then I'm talking with you on the other side of the world, probably, or in different part of the world, depending on where you are and you are watching this video. And I'm doing it because I have Wi-Fi in my university. I have internet connection and I have energy. So I have the battery of this laptop and a stable supply for the moment here in central London. So this is changing the way we are perceiving disaster recovery and disaster management, because we need to consider different needs, a different way now how society works. And then what we have seen in particular after COVID and during COVID and everything, that we are subject more than ever to concurrency. So more than one thing happened at the same time, like heat waves, flooding, happening, storms happening during pandemic, or even during war right now. And then the implication of this is that we don't have to look just to that, but considering the basis of what we are doing, well, we need to prevent and mitigate the disruption to the backbone of everything. So to the supply, to energy, to ICT, and whatever makes work the context in which we are operating right now. So if you think about it, what is a disaster? We have often different way to see disasters. We often associate it just with main hazard like earthquakes or flooding, or if we may think to something catastrophic like the triple event in 2011 in Japan, or the nuclear accident in Chernobyl. We may actually think that it was the blast in Beirut was a disaster, or we may think that different events that requiring the everyday deployment may be associated with it, depend on our threshold and the definition we use. And we may actually think that what happened with COVID, together with the direct impact of healthcare, so the supply chain was a disaster, right? So it's all but obvious. Look at these two pictures. What are the differences? Is it the same? Is it the same river? Or why? Considering what are disaster, what is disaster reduction, and what are the commonalities between these and continuity management is important. Well, the two pictures are very different because the second one, the one on the right, deals with flood, with a river in the built environment. So a flooding in the two places would have been extremely different because the built environment and the organization within operating in the built environment will be affected, right? The first one, we may not even call it a disaster. The second time, if it was in central London, like the second picture was taken from the central London, well, you may have something like the UK going back to the Stone Age. In the first case, well, maybe nobody's going to be affected. So the point is that when we think about things like climate change and climate extremes, we are not talking just about natural hazards, but we are talking about natural hazards that are going to impact the built environment and disrupt whatever there is there, including our operational capacity and society. So things like climate change are not themselves a concern, but they are a concern when we consider them together on how we operate, how we adapt, and how our operational capacity, our day-to-day activity, and now our procedures are going to be affected. So think about like that. What is a disaster? Again, we are dealing with a complex environment, which, as I was mentioning before, we have internet, we are all interconnected. And contemporary crises compared to even 20 years ago are much different. So we're dealing with compound risk, so simultaneous and successive extreme events, interacting risk, one thing triggering another one, like an earthquake triggering a tsunami, but also we are dealing with all the interdependencies associated with globalization, so interconnected risk. And what we define as cascading risk, so disruption of critical infrastructure and tight coupling system. So when we are considering our organization, we are considering our organizations in a broader view. And we are considering different scenarios that are going to affect it. And the trick is that we often think are misconceived on the idea that we are dealing with low probability events, or we are dealing with low probability scenarios that have remote possibility to happen. However, when I was working with colleagues in space physics, they told me very clearly, low probability doesn't mean it won't happen tomorrow. So the way we perceive things that happen at the same time, two crises in the same time, or the way we need to prepare for certain, things that may not happen. Well, is this a trick, right? However, we need to be practical. We need to conceive how we can optimize resources for things that we simply are not gonna persuade a CEO to prepare for. Like, I'm extremely interested in space weather, okay? The sun right now is extremely entering in a new phase in which it's gonna be more active. But I trick you, try to persuade your CEO to be prepared to something like space weather events, or start to introduce a conversation on climate change and climate adaptation. In some organizations, this is going to be off topic. However, the way to see it, think laterally, because sometimes it's a matter of when. And the key point is what, and we are going to see later on in the presentation, is what can be common between different threats, different risks, and how can we improve our practices to do that. So let's have a joke. Think about what can disrupt both a Starlink antenna and a train. Think about it. Well, I hope we all had the same answer. Right. something like some silicates. The point of this is we are dealing with complexity. We are never gonna be able to identify all the possible triggers, but the way we can conceive is how our society and our way to manage and prepare and prevent and react can be different, can be better. Well, I guess you know this picture, right? So this is Texas in January 2021. Who would have thought that we'd have a blackout during a heat wave, during a pandemic? This is what looks like low probability impact, right? But all this kind of thing happen at the same time. But what can be common in the way we prepare, we deal, and we are trying to develop resilience out of it. Our society is changed again. Think about the behaviors in terms of use of electricity in January 2021 in Texas, and maybe 40 years ago. Were the same? Well, I don't know you, but 10 years ago, I didn't have a smartphone. 20 years ago, I was used to leave small floppy disks in the post letter of my editor in the journal where I was used to work in a small village in Italy. How technology changed the behavior of society, and what are the implications for your organization when you do with it? So let's mention 1 second cascading risk. We have a complex event, right? We define that 2 things can happen at the same time, more than one, and we are all interconnected. We are dealing now with disaster crises that are all becoming cascading. So the point is that we are relying on a network of critical infrastructure and services that are essential for everything we are doing. Electricity, ICT and comms, transport, water and food supply, and also emergency services, right? We have seen it during COVID with the hospital, but also we are seeing it every day with the pictures and the points we was making before about, you know, disasters, crises, a fire in the building near ours. But what is in that building? What are the implications of this in terms of operational capacity? So think about, we were used to deal with crises and we are conceive disasters in a more linear way, in a way that, like flooding, I need to react to deal with what the flooding is triggering. You know, need to provide aid for it, recovery for it. And in terms of organization, you may simply deal with the water. Maybe you have a site near a river, you're going to shut down the site and that's all, no? Well, it's more complicated really right now because you have this flooding, but then think about what are the infrastructure in the area associated with the flooding. A small example, when I was starting my doctorate and starting to work on cascading risk in 2014, my hometown, Parma in Italy, where they make all the Parmigiano and the cheese, was affected by flooding. For the city, it was quite a big deal, but in perspective, it was not so huge. Nobody died of it. There were economic impact. But for me, the eye-opener was something else. It was this. There was a small telephone hub near the flooding area that nobody remembered about. That small telephone hub went underwater. And as a result, 3 million people in a region that is one of the economic cluster of Italy went completely down. The civil protection of my hometown at the time, that is very good. I mean, that is the part of Italy that is organized. They were used to communicate with the Facebook profile of the mayor at the time because the backup didn't work and the telephone provider was not there. My personal life at the time was curious. I was just moved here in the UK and I had elderly parents in Italy that were 25 kilometers from the flooding area in the hills, but they were without phone for 3 days. So my sister had to go from where she lives that is far away to there to check if they were fine. So a localized flooding created a cross-border crisis in terms of managing two different regions that you see in the red spot with lack of communication. So there was a first punch, the flooding, but a big hit to the economy, much far from the flooding area related to the communication and disruptions. And again, think about you're an organization there, like a private sector, like big enterprise. So where I come from is where there are many like factories and food industry, like you may have heard of Barilla, you may, in the area of the red spot, there is Ferrari, okay? There is the main plant of Ferrari. So technological disruption or operational continuity look like that. You focus on what we were used to think as critical issue, like flooding, but in reality, you need to consider the consequences and implication of things like technological failures. So the way you prepare and you consider that is how you adapt the planning and the resilience approach to all these. So you have primary threat, natural, technological, man-made, and malicious, but also how these events are going to affect other infrastructure sector that is going to impact your organization, and how all this is going to affect also emergency management. Think about climate change. One of the reasons why you need to be very concerned about that is what happens if it's more possible that two things happen at the same time. That the pressure on critical infrastructure changes, that people's behavior changes. Like, think about, there are more heat waves. What are the implications for your organization? And think about what are the implications of a blackout during an heat wave. If you what you need to prepare more for that. A critical issue to take into account is that external dependency can be very hidden. So you may think that you did already an assessment of your organization, of your interest, you did already a nice BCPIA, you know what are everything is critical, but look at this picture. This is taken from a research done by the colleagues of the European Commission last year on dependencies, on awareness of dependencies. Look at it. You may see that, yeah, everyone is aware of dependence on ICT, electric utility, transport and logistics, health. And then, for me, there is a data there that is concerned. So in this target group, there were critical infrastructure provider, just 5 answers, so 4.2%, and this was multiple choice answers, so ticked 5 times out 300, they define space and defense. And you may actually think you're a nerd. Why you are telling us that we need to concern and doing assessment of space and defense? Well, because part of the dependency on communication is associated with satellite systems. And you may not have just silly cats interrupting Starlink, but you may have other dynamics that are going on. And other organizations may have the same dependency. Think about your first responder. Well, how a fire truck is finding the destination, how an ambulance is finding the destination. Well, you use Google Maps, right? Or you use a GPS. And what about the big ships that enters in harbor? How do they enter in the harbor? Well, they have the GPS, they have a GNS, so satellite systems, and their insurance cover is associated with that, assuring that they're not going to have an accident. So no organization is an island, no person is an island, and the assessment we are doing all this is more complicated. You have things like satellites, but also more broadly, when you think to something like the big ship entering a harbor that is dependent on a small receiver, you have supply chain again. So this sentence was taken by an exercise that was developed by the colleagues of Arup with London's authority, that is called direct access exercise that is public, but one of the responder just suggested that all the insulin for the UK is produced outside. And interruption in supply chain will have cascading effects. So the interruption of the infrastructure will have cascading effects in terms of, societal unrest, for example, or broader issues of some categories of population heavily affected. This exercise was exploring the effects of blackouts and power failure. Okay, but think about what else can be common on that. Well, I just mentioned GPS and GNS, and you're gonna see more later why I'm mentioning that, and I'm coming back on that. But think about what else could cause the same effect, the same disruption. What else could affect your organization similarly? And it's not just about insulin, it's about everything else. Depending on what you are, what your organization is doing, again, we are living in an interconnected society. We have to deal with the cascading risk, with concurrency. How are you going to plan for that? How are you going to prepare for that? And what you're seeing in Ukraine. So I think we all agree that what is happening is terrible. And there are direct effects and cascading effects, both in the short term and in the long term. So what we're seeing now, and also some companies I'm working with, well, you may have been unlucky enough to have operational site in what is now the war zone. So you need maybe to deal with the alternative sites, identification, security of your personnel. Maybe you had to extract somebody and being sure that your personnel is safe. Maybe you have some of your buildings now have been completely hidden, unfortunately, or maybe they are now supporting local displacement. You may have also something else. You may issue supply chain. Maybe some of your supply was passing through Ukraine, in particular as food supply. Maybe you had some production site in the war zone, again, luckily. Or maybe you had something else that was eaten because of sanction. So maybe you had some production site on the Russian border, or you had to shut down some sites in Russia because of the effect of the sanction. Or maybe you're dealing with services that are associated with shifting out part of the system from the international banking system. So maybe you're dealing with credit, Visa, for example, with credit cards, with the Mastercard. I mean, you're part of that system. And guess what is happening again? Payments, supply chain, services. And effects on livelihood and operational cost. Okay. So in practical terms, what you may be concerned about in the longer run is intentional and intentional radioactive threats associated with an escalation of local warfare, or simply nuclear sites that are hidden in the process, or a consequence of what is going on in our outer space in terms of satellite and other systems that may actually be having issues. Or maybe we're simply unlucky enough that as the sun is in its expansion phase in terms of activity, where it's more possible that there are going to be geomagnetic storming at the same time in the next 5 years. Or maybe escalation of cyber. In Europe right now, we are starting to see the impact of displacement. Like even the small village where my family lives is hosting a lot of refugees. So it's something that is gonna change the way we are doing operations. And in the medium term, well, unfortunately, the situation is gonna affect food and energy security in terms of raising price. So even in a situation like that, no organization is an island, right? You may have been affected in the first phase by the payment system, or maybe production side, but we are all going to be affected by certain cascading effects, like, your energy bill. So when we consider preparing for complexity and preparing for a cascading crisis, the sector itself needs to be rethink. There are some practical challenges to do that I've seen, for example, in my work with the Greater London Authority. Okay, I'm not telling you that this is easy. It's difficult to visualize all the facts and prioritize those actions. There are a lot of interdependencies, like the example of satellites. I mean, I'm sure that as soon as I started to mention it, say, you were really skeptical about it. But then look at that and please check it out for your own organization. There are a lot of interdependencies. If any kind of interruption on that is not going to affect directly you, maybe it's going to affect somebody else that is going to affect you. It's a problem of jurisdiction of responsibility. High risk versus low integration in policies. And most of all, the need for focused training. That is not necessarily easy and immediate, but it's something you really need to take care about. And so the answer, you may say, is a how. So we are going to see it very soon. The baseline is not rocket science, okay? When we think about complex crises and cascading effects, the first thing is understanding the implication and put them in training. So considering cascading drivers, like what is triggered by what, but also what is gonna happening at the same time, compounding climate change, natural hazards associated with climate extreme. Then start to consider something like an infrastructure loss, like the example of Texas, okay? So you have a weather extreme, what are your needs? How are you dealing with that? Is the gasoline in the pump gonna have something that's gonna allow to take it even when it's frozen? What else is going on? Health emergency, what are the implications for your organization? I'm working on site. And how power failure, wide area of power failure, standing on that is gonna impact direct threat of life, indirect threat of lives, or operational capacity. So loss of efficiency, failure of business continuity. Do you have the contract in place? What is there, what is not there? And even if you think something that may look like more hidden, the hidden dependency of global navigation systems, what is happening at the same time? What else is going on? And how the disruption is going to affect your capacity to deal with what else is going on. So you have the first level of effects like disruption of ground transportation, even limited, but also what are going to escalate in terms of disruption, for example, of just-in-time economy. If you are in the banking sector, you may be willing to say, okay, do our synchronization have a backup as it should in case of lack of synchronization from GNS and GPS? Shortages, like associated with food supply that is not arriving. Or maybe you are an organization dealing with transport and you are stranded clients. Contamination in some cases, a synchronization of barriers. So it's not necessarily that this is rocket science, simply you need to identify everything or not, but there are some really practical things that we need to collaborate on. So first of all, consider moving that, shifting from that trigger event. What can be common between multiple things? What could be the escalation point of crisis? So think about a scenario that you have lived, okay? I'm sure every one of us have seen many. Who didn't experience a blackout or flooding or anything? Once I was driving in the middle of flooding in Haiti. I was working in international development. I was with a COV, there was a flash flood. Okay, another time, earthquakes or whatever. But in all this, what are the most critical asset and service you need to contain the situation in your organization or the organization you are dependent from, or in your supply chain, your third-party provider. Adapt scenarios and assessment. Modify strategic training and facilitate cross-sector communication. You cannot do that alone. If you are part of, for example, a network, involve and talk with your network. Share the information you can and trying to get through the one you can't share to have a common operational picture. Define the redundancy and common point of failure, and integrate policy into organizational resilience. So, everything we are dependent, we rely on, and all the organization in our universe of suppliers and providers, well, everyone is his own capacity, right? So you may be willing to start to think in terms of cascading risk. Take a blackout. How long is they gonna take before they get disrupted? Take something else, like satellite interruption. How long is gonna take before they get disrupted? Like ICT failure, how long is gonna take before they get disrupted? How? Or start to think what is gonna affect what? And depending on where, in which part of the world you are, and depending on which region, even in the US or in every single part of the world, the context you are working on, the society and the organization and the policy may be different. So the events may be unfold in a different way. You know for sure, though, that depending on how long you're gonna take before you get disrupted and your colleague get disrupted, this is gonna orient the emergency response and also your continuity. And again, in terms of relating it to climate change and climate extreme, what else is going on? What the season, the hour of the day? What else? Where are you? Is your building in a high rise? Well, you may simply tell me that, well, we consider that, but the costs are too high to have a buffering or redundancies. So there is clearly a compromise. Not everyone has infinite resources, okay? We are living in a world with scarce resources. So the way of doing it, developing your capacity, but maybe we just need to be more efficient in the way we are doing it, or simply using these to get a mindset shift. So are you considering the cascading effect in your planning strategy? So what are the vulnerability and the escalation in your area? How do technology and behavior interact together? Again, how what I'm telling you until now may require shifting your how organize your capacity. You don't take the rocket science again. Have you conducted exercises and scenarios to define the priorities and lifelines? I guess you did, right? But do you have an effective plan B that is tested and you exercised to how to keep operation in case of high-touch failure? Some of you did, right? I guess there was not a lot of preparedness about COVID, for example. Many organizations were quite successful moving to a plan B online. But what to do if you have to move plan B online and your resilience officer doesn't have a landline? You have the phone. Well, great. What happens if the phone is disrupted? Because it happens. How many of us never had a problem during a conference call in the last 2 years? Oh, come on, I had 1,000. Who never did it? We just are used to think about a highly resilient system. And again, low probability. And the way we organize is low probability. Oh, this is never going to happen. No, it's possible it's going to happen. But again, you cannot address capacity on everything, but you can create capacity considering better your visible and hidden dependency in the planning and the training process. So be effective in the use of resources. understand which are the common vulnerability between different threats, different point of failure, to move toward a risk agnostic approach. So thinking about different things, I mentioned COVID, I mentioned space weather events, geomagnetic storms, cybersecurity and satellites. But cybersecurity and satellites, space weather, well, they are a common point together. So satellites can be hacked, they can be subject to space weather events, and this can happen during COVID-19, for example. What are the implications? You're never going to persuade your senior leadership, even if they are very smart and they're forefront, to invest resources in something they have a low perception of risk, right? It's never going to happen. I'm not going to tell you to do it. But I can tell you that if you can put together the understanding of things that you may consider more remote, this may have common point of failure together with others, and you may address your resources to act on those vulnerabilities. And the way to do it is, for example, a new approach we are promoting on stress testing. So you may have heard, in particular in the financial sector, there is a lot ongoing on stress testing. So trying to understand the capacity of a system and going on to understand which are the point of failure in a situation of increasing crisis, right? Assuming that disruption will happen at some point. My suggestion is, first of all, start from a basic scenario. Single risk or single event. Then include concurrency, two things or more happening at the same time. Climate extremes. Then two things or more happening at the same time, and something else creates a cascading effect, or they create a cascading effect, like with a power failure, blackout, like what happened in Texas. So you have COVID, you have cold, and then you have a blackout. And then scenarios, this, you know perfectly what is going to happen. And then you include something like hybrid threats. So fake information, cyber attacks that can actually hamper your capacity to respond effectively. And then as a last step, test your organization capacity in case of unknown. So assume like there is a communication failure. You don't have all the information of what is going on, but you know you are affected and disrupted. Stress testing is going to become mainstream and even larger in our sector because crises again are complex. We are not going to be in an operational environment that is easier in the next 10 years. It's going to be more problematic and concerning. We are going to see more disruptions. I have a part of my ongoing work with the United Nations and the colleagues like Igor Lincoln in the US that are developing a new way to do stress testing. So keep it posted, check out our work on LinkedIn, and you're going to see a lot of stuff is coming up in the next months and years. But in conclusion, all these needs to consider about business continuity management and disaster risk reduction and disaster management are all context driven. We are seeing an increased different use of technology in the years and the different use of behavior, people behavior. I think today you are without email for 3 days because there is a disruption. What are the implications of it? Well, I can tell you that, again, when I started the university, I was working the same newspaper I was telling you, the one of the floppy disks. I didn't have an email. They made my first email. I just came from like a short break for Easter, like 3-4 days looking at email. I'm doomed. I don't know yours, but how you're going to communicate with your colleagues if you don't have access for the next 2 days? What is your backup plan? What is your backup plan if that is not working and your phone, for example, is not working? Do you have a landline? I don't. I'm in central London. Nobody has a landline. But I'm not a resilience officer. Are you? What are they doing? Bridging the field, we are to a point in which, again, disruption may happen. They're going to happen. There is no way out. This is the elephant in the room. Complex crisis implies that even if we think we are highly resilient, we need to better prioritize what you have and doing our criticality assessment in a different way, considering our own organization, but also with the universe of the other organization. And for example, we are proposing as an approach for the forthcoming United Nations Global Assessment Report that a virtuous thing that continuity management can teach to the broader field of disaster reduction is understanding criticality and defining priorities at the societal level. So what we need to address resources first, what second, what third, and what is common between different threats of different origin to contain the escalation of cascading effects. So I hope this gives you some hints on what is evolving, what we're going to see. Please consider what are the criticalities of your organization in terms of interdependencies, but also how they're going to be affected by cascading effects in other sectors. And what is going to happen if two or more things are going on at the same time. Try to do stress testing, starting from something basic and scaling up to understand which are the common points of failure on which you can practically act. And maybe it's not going to be that you need something strange like a model. Maybe you just need some clear communication procedure of what to do in case of a disruption at the broader level. Please do get in touch with me if you have any questions. Get in touch with LinkedIn, and I hope you found these interesting.